We're going to start out with introductions, and each panel member will present about a 5-minute presentation to get the discussion going, and then we're looking at for questions from the audience so we can have a good dialogue and potential debate on this particular issue. So, Dr. Johnson.
Okay, can I have the first slide, please? The second slide. Okay, well, thanks again for having me here. It's a great panel composition. I want to begin by talking about, again, what I think we're facing now, not just in the future, that will extend into the future. And start by emphasizing the Army's pacing threat. Russia is ahead of us in many critical areas. We have gaps in specific areas, most notably defense against rockets, anti-tank guided missiles, and manpads that are used by clients besides Russia. We have not prepared for the wars we could be in because we've been focused on the wars we are in. That is shifting. But my view is that we will not overmatch these adversaries without significantly more investment and, quite frankly, a threat-based approach to concepts and technology. Next chart. So I believe that concepts and their associated capabilities will fail if they're not grounded in the imperative to understand the adversary and how to defeat him. My sense is this was the principal failure of FCS, conceptual, not materiel or acquisition. The concept ignored the fight we were in and designed a system for the fight we wanted to be in, and the capabilities we demanded of those systems drove material requirements that were not realizable in the term in which we had to employ them. The last time we had this kind of failure, where it was actually in war, with our Army was in state-level warfare in World War II with concepts and technologies for armor, and also strategic bombing, which is a subject for another day and a lot of beer. The Army believed that the proper use of armored formations was essentially that of horse cavalry formations they replaced. The concept envisioned using tanks and long-range thrusts deep into the enemy's rear where they would chew up his supply installations and communications, exploitation, and pursuit. In this concept, tanks would not fight other tanks. That was the role of General Leslie McNair's pet project, the tank destroyer. The Army's concepts for tanks drove technology. What the Army wanted was a tank with great endurance, low fuel consumption, and the ability to move great distances without breakdown. A low-velocity 75-millimeter gun was deemed sufficient for these tanks, given the concept, and would also help with logistics because gun tubes would not have to be replaced very often. There were also design restrictions. Tanks were limited to 30 tons and a width of 103 inches until late 1944 to facilitate overseas shipping, deployment, and the use of the Army's existing portable bridges, which had a 30-ton weight limitation. Unfortunately, as one Army ordnance specialist noted, Hitler's tanks violated this American rule. Evidence from the North Africa campaign showed that the Germans had tanks that outmatched ours, and this evidence was ignored. Conceptual issues for North Africa were viewed as minor, requiring only organizational tweaks and better training. Next slide. In June 1944, our armored concepts and tanks crashed into reality. American tanks had to fight German panzers and were inferior, as General Marshall noted in his biannual report at the end of the war. The tank that's shown here, the Sherman 75, is the tank we wanted and procured. The Tiger II is the tank we had to fight. From Normandy to Berlin, the war was a battle of attrition won by combined arms, particularly the use of tactical air power, artillery, and superior numbers. And from June 1944 to May 1944, General Bradley's 12th Army Group alone had a staggering loss of 3,200 medium tanks and 800 light tanks. General Eisenhower, quite frankly, was not aware of this problem until the Battle of the Bulge, when a number of sergeants started talking to the press and created what was known as the Sherman scandal by talking to the press. Eisenhower went to two of his best division commanders, General Rose and General White, and said, tell me this isn't true. And they said, it's worse than the sergeants are saying. Immediately, Eisenhower implored the War Department to field the M26 Pershing tank with a 90-millimeter gun as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, only 20 of these tanks arrived in Europe before the end of the war and saw combat. Importantly, the Pershing could have been available much earlier, but it was not demanded by the field, nor did it fit Army concepts for armor. and it would have slowed down the overall tank production cycle and the acquisition cycle. Next slide. An interesting but admittedly ahistorical question, which historians aren't supposed to do, but I'm going to do anyway, is what would have happened if the failure of the Sherman was not so public? My view is that the Sherman would have remained the Army's main battle tank long after World War II, and it was in Korea and it was used in the '67 war in Israel, given the Army's rapid post-war demobilization and budget cuts, an Army that goes from 8 million to less than 1 million in 2 years. And if the Sherman had the same modernization and life extension program as the Abrams, it would have been in service until 2012 and beyond. We should ask ourselves if current efforts to keep improving existing systems until 2050 are similar. Next slide. In conclusion, I believe World War II still has highly relevant lessons for Army modernization. We will likely fight competent state adversaries or adversaries with their equipment, and we've not actually done this since World War II. In these fights, combat vehicles matter a lot, and only 3 attributes fundamentally matter when measured against our pacing adversary: lethality, survivability, and combat mobility. Everything else is secondary. And we need to apply the same ruthless standard to all of our concepts and material modernization efforts and answer one question: can they defeat our adversaries in a combined arms multi-domain battle fight? Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
General Wesley.
Well, good morning. I'm Eric Wesley. I command Fort Benning Maneuver Center of Excellence. A lot of the work that Dr. Johnson is talking about originates at Fort Benning. I'm glad to see you all here because you are obviously the ones that had the staying power to stay to day 3. I wanted to start with Dr. Johnson because the topic today is the maneuver force modernization strategy. But you can't have a strategy unless you understand the pacing threat against which you're building your modernization strategy against. So it would be probably ineffective if I let off. But it's important to talk about pacing threats, and for a number of years we've talked about capability gaps, and it's time for us to focus on a pacing threat, and that's what we're doing down at the Maneuver Center of Excellence. Before I went too far, I wanted to read, I was looking at a document recently, and you might recognize it, but this is a statement in exhorting us to modernize. It says, if the United States fails to transform, then our current military superiority and the relative peace, prosperity, and stability it underwrites will erode. We will see the rapid emergence of regional competitors and a world prone to conflict. Operations in such an environment would be conducted at much greater cost to the nation. At best, the United States would be forced to invest increasing shares of national wealth in forces with diminishing capabilities. At worst, we would eventually face the historic norm, a major battlefield reversal and the rapid rise of a major competitor. That was published in 2003, and sadly, it's become prophetic. So what that says to us is we have a problem. I think on one of the slides that Dr. Johnson noted, it said we have done this before when we had to, but at great cost in blood and treasure. Typically, we don't do well in the interwar years in preparing for the next fight. If you go back to World War I, if you look at Battle of Kasserine Pass in World War II, if you look at Task Force Smith in Korea, we didn't do well leveraging the interwar years to prepare for the next fight. But we've also had successes. A particular notable success is the 1970s, when we did look at our competitor, the Soviet Union, and we did build an army against it, and we did preclude what probably could have been one of the most horrific wars of the last century by virtue of that preparation. So what does that model look like? I want to just talk about that for a minute before I tell you what we're doing. That model looked like the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Abrams, challenging one of his brigadiers, General Starry, to go over to Israel and review what occurred in the Yom Kippur War. And look what our near peer had produced in the form of satellite states. And the result of that was the Starry study, which later became, when General Starry became the TRADOC commander, the Battlefield Development Plan, which was published in 1978. You could allude to that as a concept. And that concept drove the efforts of building the Army that we have today across the entire DOTML PF enterprise, to include material, the Big Five, which we know, doctrine, later to become air-land battle, versions published in 1982 and 1986. It changed our leader development through professional military education, the way we put together small group instruction at the career courses. It changed our training with Army Training 1990, published in 1981, which later became FM 25-100-101. It changed the way we did our training in the field by virtue of the exploitation of our DIRT CTCs, because we knew with air-land battle you needed more space to train. The point I'm making here is that the Starry study and the concept that followed drove the building of the entire Army that you see today and that we leveraged in 1991 and in OIF-1 in Iraq. So what are we doing? If you go to the next slide, this is just a mental model that really frames what I just described that we did in the 1970s. It starts in 2014 with the publication of the Army Operating Concept at the AUSA convention in the fall. And in February 2016, General Perkins commissioned the Russian New Generation Warfare Study, which we fondly call Starry 2. It was headed up by Brigadier General Jones. He went to Ukraine and he wanted to see what our near peer was doing in Ukraine. Parallel with that, we've been developing the Maneuver Force Modernization Strategy, which is driven by the Army Functional Concept for Movement and Maneuver, which was just recently signed by General McMaster. It was his first act as the National Security Advisor, so we think we've got concurrence from the White House. But now you've got a look at the enemy in the Russian New Generation Warfare Study. You have a functional concept, but off that functional concept you need a maneuver force modernization strategy, which gives an azimuth and decision points to the chief over time in order to build a new maneuver force, and it's got to be looked at as a formation and across the entire DOTML PF exercise. I'm going to shorten things up here a little bit, but what we need from industry, what we need from the entire enterprise, frankly, if this is to work, is that industry and the entire enterprise needs to understand the concept, because the concept is the lens through which we build the future force, because it gives us an azimuth to where we're going, so that when we're making trades within the palm, and you see that block over there on the right, the cross-portfolio trade, and now that's where the chief and the building spend 90% of their time every day. And without this azimuth, without the maneuver force modernization strategy, those decisions will always be sub-optimized. So I'll stop there. We've got other initiatives I could talk about, but I've used my 5 minutes, and I think I was the sponsor of the 5. So.
Thank you, General Wins.
Okay, thank you, and again, I appreciate the opportunity to participate in another panel. I think a lot of what I can talk about from an RD&E perspective is similar to what I said during the panel on Monday. But what I will tell you is, number one, having spent a little time in TRADOC, having spent some time in Headquarters Department of the Army, G8, and now spending time in AMC, I've kind of had an opportunity to see the full breadth and depth of what we have to do to go from concepts to capabilities. And so looking at the chart that Eric Wesley talked about, it struck me that in the command of research, development, and engineering, and the 14,000 personnel, 10,000 of which are scientists and engineers, we have the ability to participate and play in all that and help and shape all of those areas. On Monday, I talked about 3 particular areas, which I will restate again. The first thing is about our ability to collaborate. And as a research development enterprise, we have to be willing and able to collaborate, not only with industry, not only with academia, but we need to be able to collaborate within the Army with the various sectors of the folks that are responsible for going from concept to capability. So when you look at that model and you think about thinking, learning, analyzing, and implementing, We play and we have to participate in the area of the thinking piece to make sure that the folks who are envisioning and talking about how the Army will fight in the future understand where technology is and where technology is going, so that we don't overreach in our ability to come up with solutions to help the Army fight and to fight better and to win. When you think about the area of prototyping, a lot has been said here about the impact and the effect of prototyping when we talk about tech demonstration type prototyping, experimental prototyping. The importance of that, the importance of collaborating with industry, working with academics folks, working with the field, the soldier, to give them the ideas, give them things to look at, to say this is how technology can come together in such a way to give you a capability. Does it work for you? Is it lethal enough? Does it provide you enough protection? Does it provide you speed, the agility that you need? Will it be effective not only in the Army that we have right now, as an Army that is going to be reliant on being able to rapidly deploy, but also once you get to the fight, will you have the power to do what you need to do? And then the third piece is working with the acquisition community about transitions. How do we ensure that the technology that we are either working on directly within RD&E or the technology that we are working in partnership or characterizing that exists out in industry, how do we work to make sure that those transitions can occur? And so a lot of collaboration has to occur in those areas as well. So what that means to me as I've come into command over the past 8 months is that RD&E as a command with a very unique set of people in their workforce had to be operationalized. And the need to operationalize was to ensure that they were focused on the problems, the most pressing problems of the Army, and the need to ensure that people understood the technology areas that the research, development, engineering community could provide for the Army, and how they could help them in solving the problem of understanding how the Army will fight. It's also to make sure that we help shape the Army, because as we exist in environments where resources flourish, there's a tendency to be very, very freewheeling in our thinking, freewheeling in how we go after stuff. But when resources begin to diminish, we have to really stop and be very, very judicious about where our investments are. And so that calls for us to have a good, coherent strategy of how we're going to go after things. It also calls for us to make sure that we help shape and we understand what the priorities of the Army are. I believe that in a lot of ways, the work that's being done down in TRADOC, the priorities that are being set forth by the Chief of Staff of the Army, the processes that we are now refining as a result of acquisition reform are getting us on that path. There's a lot of work to do, and I think that we still play a vital role in making sure that we are integrated in all parts of going from concept to capabilities, to make sure that the force understands and the leaders understand how technology plays and the vital role that it can help to solve solutions. So thank you.
General Lennox.
So I'm Bob Lennox. I've got almost three years of experience in industry, and today I'm the industry rep. And I promise to trade off my experience in industry with strong and sometimes uninformed opinions. But I will be very forceful in expressing them. Lieutenant General retired Tom Spohr, a friend of many of us here, now works for the Heritage Foundation. And Tom recently said that given budget constraints and loss of funding associated with the termination of a number of programs, the Army's had little alternative to pursue a strategy of incremental upgrades and small programs, and that's really all that we're doing. Meanwhile, as Dave Johnson pointed out, adversaries are not subject to the Budget Control Act and have continued to develop and field new equipment. And then recently there's a gentleman named Blake Byers in the Weekly Recon who wrote, While the Army struggled to advance ground combat systems, the Air Force got the F-35A, the KC-46, the B-21. The Navy got the Littoral Combat Ship, the Ford-class carrier, the F-35C, and the Columbia-class strategic ballistic missile submarine. The Marine Corps got the amphibious combat vehicle and the F-35. Blake then goes on to say that so far the Army's most notable advancement has been the modular service pistol. Now, I think that may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but the point's made. You understand the point. And at the same time, our 7 to 10-year maturations of our normal programs don't work in this environment, either the threat environment or the budget environment. They just don't work. So I thought if I could talk for a minute about ways that we could innovate together and those things that stifle innovation and maybe how we can get at solving those problems. And I'll touch on some of them, and if you're interested, we could talk about it either during the question and answer or later. So what's the incentive for industry to innovate? Well, fundamentally, it's capitalism. Industry does what DoD wants it to do, or they don't survive. They respond to the market. Companies that don't respond to the market, they go away. They lose. They don't respond in capability, timeliness, or cost. They lose, and they either adapt or die. So if the DoD is observing a systemic problem with the lack of innovation by industry, and that's why they go to Silicon Valley, it's a fair question to ask whether or not the problem is solely with each and every one of the multitude of companies within the industrial base, or is a root cause within the processes that are employed by the Department of Defense. If there is a competitive advantage to being innovative, I'd argue that the most innovative companies would grow market share, and ultimately the entire defense industrial base would become more innovative as a result, solely due to competition and a desire to give shareholders the return on their investment. So I suggest that perhaps there's a challenge with how the DoD measures and manages risk and how it rewards its acquisition leaders and ultimately how it awards contracts and makes purchasing decisions. My West Point classmate Jim Greer recently wrote a very good article about strategy in general and risk-taking and innovation in general, and I'm going to quote a very small part of it. And he said that today's Army thinks in terms of conventional and symmetrical operations rather than innovative and asymmetrical ones. Even our special forces have fallen into predictable patterns of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that the horse soldiers of 2001 are long gone. And Jim wrote that in a Strategy Bridge in an article called The Weaker Foe. So how is innovation and risk-taking rewarded? Is it rewarded in our request for proposals, or is lowest cost rewarded? Is innovation given credit in sections L and M of the proposals? And I'm not, like I said, 3 years an expert in this, but I don't see it very much. And then what happens to intellectual property? Is the reward for winning that you surrender your intellectual property? And how short-sighted is that? Because it may save you money short-term, but long-term, what happens to the intellectual capital in those industries now? Funding. So I was involved a little bit in resourcing in my time. Do we have innovative ways to reward industries rapidly for the risks that they may take to get us capabilities to the field quickly? Congress has not supported that generally. Can we work together, DoD and industry, to approach Congress and start to build faith and trust in rewarding innovation in the short term? Coming forward with a program today and then waiting 2 years to resource it is not necessarily a very close gap between risk and reward. So another topic is our tolerance of failures. Can we design systems, prototypes, and methods that allow us to try new ideas even if we end up failing early? I think industry would respond very well to this approach. Insourcing. Cedric and I had a conversation earlier about the concerns about insourcing. Many in industry are afraid to approach the RDEX with their ideas. They're afraid of losing their intellectual property. And that has caused, true or not, that's caused reticence among folks I know from teaming. And although there are many creatives out there, I think there could be many more opportunities. And how are we showing partnership and trust? And I've broken this into 4 or 5 categories. I'll be very quick. Can we partner with our processes like PEO GCS did on selecting the 30-millimeter Stryker on top of the 30-millimeter going on top of the Stryker? GD Land Systems actually did the competition to shorten time. Can we partner with soldiers and get soldiers on equipment earlier so we get it right? Can we partner with the test community The FAA doesn't test the new Gulfstream. Gulfstream has FAA certified testers that are required to meet that standard. Can we look at our processes on testing? So I've spoken about a lot of opportunities about partnership and innovation that I think we can do better at. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Kevin.
So I'm Kevin Fahey. Some of you know me as I retired from the government as a civilian in December 15. I'm an acquisition guy through and through. Started as an engineer, but I was deputy PEO ammunition. I was a deputy PM for one of those combat vehicles that got canceled. I was PEO ground combat systems, and I was PEO combat support, combat service support, and then I spent a couple of years in the Pentagon to enjoy that life. I would just start by, it's really interesting to hear Lieutenant General Lennox bitch about resourcing, right?
I laid it off on that.
So what they asked me to do is talk about industry collaboration, right? And so, I like to pride myself on believing that I did it well, but some probably would say not. And there's obviously all kinds of collaboration, and I'll go through some of it. So if you think about it, these conferences, right? They're great collaboration. The messages that the Army wants to send and what's important to us. And what I tell you, continuous engagements, right? It's at everybody, whether it be the commandants out in the field or the people in the Pentagon or the PEO should have open door policies. I believe on programs of record, we should have continuous websites that tell industry exactly where the requirements are and what's going on. We also should have standard, easy processes to figure out how to get to people, right? What I tell you is, this is my personal opinion, is we don't have consistent processes. What you do in one community is different than a different community. In a lot of instances, they change based on the PEO or who's in charge, right? Because it's personality driven. What I tell you on both sides, government and industry have to be open-minded, right? Too often, we on either side say, I only know what I know, and that's what I'm going to believe in. What you have to say really is not of very much value to me. For industry, it's always important to let them know what you're looking for, what's important. Sometimes people don't understand what's also more important or as important in industry is what does the government value, right? You hear too often, and I hear it a lot now. I've been working with industry for 15 months. I like to believe I understood them better than most as a PEO. But it's really when people say, I need to know what the requirements are, but I also need to know in section L and M what you're going to value. Too often I hear industry say the government is technically acceptable lowest bid. And when I read the RFP, I do not read it that way, but their perception is that's how the government does things, right? So when you're talking about range or whatever, and you think there's value in there, you got to tell industry how you're going to give them what's the cost and what's it worth, right? Because as long as you don't, they're going to believe as long as I'm technically acceptable and lowest bid is how I'm going to win, which I don't think in most instances that's what we want. What I would argue, we also need to be give feedback on both ways, right? Industry to the government and us to them. I tell you, and I'm biased, I think what we're doing on the mobile protective firepower is outstanding. We've, done RFIs to get information from industry, and then we have industry engagements. I would argue in a lot of instances we do that too late in the process. We don't have RFIs or engagements with industry until it becomes a program of record. What you see on mobile protective firepower, it's happening now on the requirements with Fort Benning, which is where I think it really should start at the beginning with the requirements. I would also argue industry days are really important. What I've seen is quote-unquote shit industry days, right, where we tell industry very little, and our job as the government is to check the box, right, where what's really important is that we tell industry exactly what we want and exactly what we're expecting from them. I would argue too often and not, the government is too paranoid about protests. right? What I'd argue, you shouldn't be paranoid about it because it's going to happen, whether you're paranoid about it or not. You probably, this is what I've seen, right? And I've given counsel is in a lot of instances, the reason I see industry protesting is because they don't know why the government made the decision. Right, and their only way to find out is to protest, right? So I'd argue if we were better and open with our information and tell industry everything, it could cut down on protests, not increase them. You know, and a couple of things that you heard during the week, you know, I think Jim Young says, you know, what you incentivize is what gets done. You know, you heard General Lennox talk about it, right? I mean, is basically industry doesn't do what we want, right? Industry does what the government funds, right? And so for the most part, you know, we got to incentivize internal to the government and external to the government what we want done. There was discussion about let's talk about outcomes, right? Not about the processes and those kind of things, and incentivize the outcomes, right? And I think that's really important. I would argue in a lot of instances the thing we got to overcome is the culture, right? I mean, when people ask me a lot of times, where do you think this program should lie, which PEO? I usually tell them, well, let me know when you're going to make a decision, and I will tell you not based on system engineering, I'll tell you based on personalities, right? Because it's really all about personalities and who could get it. It's because it's all about collaboration, right? And so if you don't have somebody that doesn't collaborate, you're not going to get what you want. The other thing I would just add before I complete is that when we talk about industry engagement, and we had a discussion before this, is how, you know, I would argue on the earliest industry day, we should have soldiers there. We should almost have soldiers talk to industry about what the soldiers want, right? Too often than not, the first time we get a soldier input to industry is when we're testing a thing in IoT&E, right? Which is probably a little too late, right? So that would be the last thing I would add.
Thank you, Kevin. We're going to transition to question, and as we discussed before, panel members, all of you are free to comment, but some of them are directed at panel members. The first group, actually it's a group of questions that deal with sustainment, so I'm going to use one that captures all the sustainment piece, and again, feel free to, who would like to chime in first. The multi-domain battlefield involves joint combined arms maneuver as outlined in the Army Functional Concept Movement and Maneuver. A key tenet is to provide the enemy with multiple dilemmas with semi-independent combat teams that operate without resupply for 5 to 7 days. In order to support this tenet, this concept included a requirement of 50% demand reduction in order to make the initial basic load and the resupply of the basic load an attainable goal. How can the Army achieve the goal of 50% reduction?
Yeah, let me lead on this one. We published the document at Fort Benning, and first thing I will say is that when you look at a concept, a lot of times you'll get feedback where people will say, well, that concept is not feasible. And if you get a concept that's not feasible, you probably got a good concept. Because if it's feasible, it ought to go right to doctrine. The purpose of a concept is to give you an azimuth, a reach goal, a stretch goal, so that you can give industry and the labs the focus areas where you want to improve. And we know that we're going to have to become semi-independent based on the battlefield we described. In fact, what the document says is up to 7 days, and with a goal of 50% reduction. We don't know that we can achieve that, and we don't even know if that'll be sufficient. But we do know that that is a priority for industry and for the labs.
So I don't want to be trite, but one way is shoot half as much. You know, have capable systems that are able to engage at longer ranges that, you know, reduce the demand for ammunition. But I think that if you put sustainment ahead of, you know, the ability to defeat the adversary systems, you end up where we did in the 1930s, which was a requirement when we built tanks. Lethality, survivability, mobility, there's an iron triangle: protection, mobility, lethality. And to do those, you add weight. And the determining factor in the 1920s was the chief of engineers told the chief of infantry and cavalry, who were the opponents, you know, I've got a bridge that carries 15 tons, and build any tank you want as long as it goes across a 15-ton bridge. And you couldn't do it. So I think the question is, are we going to drive this process with a focus on sustainment, or are we going to drive with a focus on lethality, survivability, and combat mobility? And the trade should be more pre-positioned ammunition or whatever, but you can't give up the overmatch in combat, in close combat against the adversary, because you want to take less stuff with you.
So I would add, right, so how do you do that, right? It's sort of, we talked about it, incentivize the outcomes, right? Haven't been there, right? Historically, when we put the requirements and priorities, move, shoot, communicate, right, and survive, right? Usually the sustainment requirements aren't that high a priority when they're considered. I would argue do prototyping often and early, right? And I would say let the user on early prototyping ask for everything they need so that you could figure out what does it cost to do these things, and is that what I really want, and can I do all the things I have to do, defeat the enemy being number one, right, and sustain, and how do I make those trades when I really got to buy the combat vehicle?
Okay, so I think, number one, I think kind of the thing that struck me about that statement that was taken was about the piece that talked about 50% demand reduction. So, and mind you, I'm not an engineer and I'm not a scientist, but I've had the benefit of the last 8 months of just kind of listening to some of their ideas that come about. And I think one of the things that strikes me, and certainly they would either amplify it or they would have no problem with disagreeing, is you've got to think about that problem of 50% demand reduction more holistically. So you have to think about a range of areas with which you can achieve some portion or portions of that type of effect if you wanted it for the individual soldier or you wanted it for the formation. And some of the areas that we're looking at within the S&T arena and the research and development arena is, can you achieve some measure of demand reduction through autonomy? And so there's work going on in those areas that perhaps if you could find a means of lightening the load of the individual soldier through autonomy, that helps. Now, the tendency would be, okay, how do you respond to that doctrinally from a TTP perspective? Once I've lightened your load, does that mean it gives you the wherewithal and the bandwidth to load it back up with something else? But nonetheless, autonomy could certainly help. I think that in areas where we talk about some of our systems, we talk about the areas in material science that are being looked at for our platforms to reduce the weight of the platforms, which could go a ways in terms of formation lightening of load. The reliability of our systems, having systems that have better energy efficiency, that can operate at longer distances over time, those things perhaps can add to some of the efficiencies of lightening the load. And then, of course, I think something that most warfighters would certainly want is increased lethality. So if I give you better lethality in your tanks, in your munitions, then does that create a condition where you say, well, I know if I'm going to get one hit, one kill, then does that mean I have to carry the amount of ammunition? Do I have to have the resupply rates that are necessary? So to me, there's a range of areas that can be looked at. And I think what we have to do is, number one, we have to look at it holistically, and we have to really make sure that we're focused on the right problem. Hearing what I heard in that quoting, it seemed to me that we have an opportunity to think about things from a broader perspective of 50% demand reduction.
Very quickly, if I could, I think concepts have a place to challenge people to think innovatively, and the places in the S&T community where Cedric is, or early in prototyping, as Kevin talked about. It's when those concepts become locked in concrete somehow in the key requirements, they lead you to challenges then as you're building a program that lend it to be unaffordable or unachievable. And Kevin lived the JLTV dilemma where we had mean time between failure as a requirement that was extraordinarily large, like 6 times the Humvee mean time between failure, and it was going to drive it to a heavier vehicle and more costly. And in the trades process, we traded it away. But it was in danger of completely, that and a number of other ones, in danger of completely unraveling the program. So it's just a caution.
Just since General Lennox brought it up, just to add, so here's part of the problem we all got to deal with, and I think General Lennox pointed out, it's the test, right? What I tell you, in addition to what General Lennox said, to a large extent, the reason we traded reliability, which just blew my mind, is because the testers were telling us we had to buy like twice as many vehicles and spend twice as much time in test, right? So our goal was to get the JLTV to the field, right? And we were trying to get it in 3 years. The testers wanted us to buy twice as many vehicles and test it for like another damn year. And so as a community, we went right to the JROC after our released the RFP meeting, and we traded that requirement, not that it's not a goal that I think JLTV will meet, but it was really so we didn't have to buy, what I would tell you, a stupid number of vehicles and test them before we field them. I would argue in a lot of instances we could build reliability after we filled it, as long as you're on the path and on the reliability growth curve.
Hey, Kevin, along that line, one of the questions are there any other changes we can pursue in test and evaluation to use industry testing more?
The answer is absolutely, right? And I'll tell you, I mean, I learned this probably when I was at GS1, right, is testing proves testing works. I would argue it doesn't necessarily prove that the vehicle works, right? And too many times we get through the test and then we field it and go, oh, damn, we didn't test it that way. Because, and what a lot of times is they test it to requirements that we don't even have, right? And I'll give you a perfect example of how bad it can be, right, is we recompeted the family of medium tactical vehicles that we had been producing for 20 damn years. A new producer won it, and basically DOT&E was insisting on doing like 100,000-mile operational test. I said, it's the same damn truck. And it wasn't until I went to Dr. Carter did I get that turned around. True story. I got a call from the lead of DOT&E who just left, so you can figure out who that is, who basically said, I heard what you did. I will get you on your next program. So, I mean, that's the situation we're in. And oh, by the way, that organization reports to Congress. They don't report to the Secretary of Defense, per se. As many times as we try to change that, right, in some instances, and I would argue reliability drives the timeline. We could build, on anything we've ever fielded, we build reliability after we field it, right? I mean, and because we usually don't drive vehicles exactly like the OMSMP, like we test it, right? So I would argue there's absolutely a lot of work, but nobody knows how to do it because they report to Congress.
Great.
Major General Wins, with some things will always remain government domain, has the time come to shrink the government R&D force structure? In the aggregate, are the RDACs leading the capability growth, or is it the investment for the in-house development disproportionate to the capability expansion?
Okay. So I think there's a couple of points I'd make about what goes on in the arena of research, development, and engineering. First of all, it's certainly true that within RD&E-Com and the decks in the labs, there is a fair amount of work that goes on in technology development that we lead. However, there's a lot of work that goes on in research, development, and engineering where the research, development, and engineering enterprise of our decks and labs are working, particularly in foundational or basic research and applied research, with academic institutions. Okay, and so that partnership is critical because oftentimes leveraging the power of those academic institutions leads you to solutions that not only have a military-specific application, but they certainly could have an application somewhere down the road in the commercial space, and there's a lot of examples that apply to that. We've also had, within our research and development engineering centers, working with the folks in the Department of the Army headquarters, our international engagements are designed to ensure that collaboration occurs with international partners, international contract community, international institutions to, again, work on technology, maturing technology, looking at things that are out there to get after things that not only have a military application, but perhaps have a commercial application as well. So to say that within the Research, Development, and Engineering Centers that only the things that are going on is technology development misses the point that there's a range of things that are going on not only with academic institutions, both in the United States but internationally, but also with industry to help develop things that have a technical application for the military and have a commercial application as well. I think that technology development, from what I've observed, it works well in some circles and it doesn't work well in others. In other words, we have to continue to work to make improvements. I think that in the areas where it seems to work well, the Army or the military, we are at or in tandem in terms of the lead. We are the foremost experts, or we're close to the foremost experts in a particular space. So say, for example, aviation, rotary wing type aviation particularly. Because we are at or at least in parallel with commercial industry in the level of expertise in that area, there's a tendency for us to partner better. And there's a tendency for us to collaborate better and to come up with results that are mutually beneficial to commercial industry and the military application. In those areas where we lag in our technical expertise because there's a high demand in commercial industry, I think we struggle. We struggle mightily to try to look for opportunities to collaborate, look for opportunities to work together. And so we have to just try to figure out how we do that. One of the ways I think we do that goes to the point of doing experimental prototyping, bringing industry in to partner with us on the development of things and areas. General Lennox talked a little bit about intellectual property. I would say that, and I kind of get, when I go back to my headquarters, like people always caution me about how I say this, but I would say I don't see how it does the Army any good to work in partnership or work alone and develop intellectual property and not being willing to share it, subject to the proper restrictions that the lawyers will advise you of and so on. But it does us no good. It does us no good to develop technology and then put it on the shelf. It only does us good if we develop the technology and we see the utility in how it's going to empower, unburden, or protect a soldier, that we get it to industry so that they have the capacity to take it further and or produce it in a system or systems that work for us. You could certainly make the argument that we need to look into areas where we find efficiencies in our RDECs and labs, but I think you also need to be mindful of, just like the organic industrial base, you need to be mindful of what will you have and what will you need in the event that a crisis comes about where we have to turn and leverage a technical base that understands how to turn things quickly for the Army. Over the last 15 years, we've certainly had a number of examples of capability that we've provided based on what engineers and scientists, both in the Army and outside of the Army, have been able to produce, things like counter-IED capability, things that have gotten us certain other types of capability in robotics, system autonomy, better armament systems that came about. Well, you don't get that, I don't believe, if you don't have a technical base that is there to respond.
Can I argue
General Wesley?
a little bit of that? I know you've got a ton of other questions to get through, but I don't think the cooperation is where it should be. And I think the areas that General Wynn just talked about, where the decks and labs are especially strong on basic research and collaborating with academia, are clearly their roles. When they start to compete with industry and the funding comes through the labs, now you have a position where there's a disincentive sometimes to work there because of worry about intellectual property, worrying about what's going to, will you have a role? And just as you said, Cedric, about a role in times of emergency of needing a certain capability, I'd argue that some of your industries, like your one tank plant, might fit into that same category. And if you don't have engineers that have experience building a tank, and when did we build the last tank from scratch? And is there anybody alive today that knows how to do that, are key questions. We lose that capability, frankly, because we maintain things in labs and don't share, feed, prototype with industry. So intellectually, it's the right thing to do in both cases, but we've got to figure out ways to partnership and make it work.
Just want to reinforce what you said, sir, and what General Wynn said. We've got to get faster. We have to get more agile. If you go back to my opening comments, we've got a bit of a problem. And with the proliferation of information and intelligence and weapon systems, we've got to turn at a faster rate. If you go to Google, they'll say that the larger an institution gets, the more resistant to innovation and collaboration and agility increases, or decreases rather. And the only way they can sustain their innovation and their collaboration is when they either buy startups separate from the company or create pods separate from the institutional processes. So consistent with that and consistent with the need, what you're going to see come out of Fort Benning soon is a request for a charter to build the next generation combat vehicle. It'll be an ICDT that empowers us to pull together the requirements folks, the resourcing folks, the acquisition community, the labs, and even industry in a collaborative effort to get after NGCV so we can turn in tighter circles, make trades with informed information.
Yes, sir. Along that line, and a discussion for the whole group here, is that the emerging requirement of industry research and development, and the requirement that, and I'm not sure if it's finalized yet, that industry has to get government approval for their R&D efforts. So if you're arguing to move, let's call it way left of RFP, get them involved earlier, that could that potentially include early approval for IR&D efforts to allow industry to simultaneously develop this piece, and for General Wynn's, maybe even a collaborative piece with research and development out of RD&E. So if you want to discuss that, Kevin?
I'd just like to add real quick, right? So, and I think it's something Dr. Russell said the other day, right? So I don't think it's a numbers thing, right? I think it's more of we've lost, to an extent, the ability to collaborate and do integration across. The war has trained us to do certain things. And what I heard the last couple of days is it's not only the R&D labs with industry. In some instances, many instances, I heard the R&D labs talk differently than their PEOs. Right? So I think the war has created as a PEO, there wasn't a time I went to theater that I didn't find crap on my vehicles that didn't belong there, right? And I think that's what happened is everybody was in a hurry or helping to put the best stuff on everything and anything, and we sort of lost the how we do a better job of collaborating and working together. I don't think it's a numbers thing. It's just how do we think we're all on the same team? I mean, I don't believe there's such a thing as proprietary government information, as General Wynn said, everybody should have that, right? And we just have to get back to how do we collaborate and integrate better, right?
Slight change of subject. Dr. Johnson, you discussed the modernization of the Sherman tank over the years, and I'm going to follow up. Is the model of essentially upgrading all vehicles, e.g. the M1s, in the class the right approach?
So I'm always reminded in these discussions of a great cartoon from the 70s by Pogo, the character. We have found the enemy and he is us. So I think the question I'd ask about prototyping, what happens with the prototype is it successful? And our approach is, like with modernization, is no BCT left behind. So the plan is to field JLTV eventually to every formation in the Army. And the question is, over a 30-year period, is that a viable approach? Or do you want to do, quite frankly, what the Germans did in World War II and the Russians are doing now, which is recognize when you have a system in combat that can't participate in the fight without great risk, like the Panzerkampfwagen III, they upgraded the 4. They upgraded the 4 to a 75 millimeter long barrel during that period. But at the same time, on the Eastern Front, they realized that T-34 could not be defeated by a Panzerkampfwagen IV. So they started building the Panther and fielding it. They didn't take all the 4s out. They started building the Tiger I and the Tiger II. And the whole military was not made of Tiger Is or Tiger IIs. It was just spread across because you kept adding capability as you modernized what you had, with the understanding that what you had that you're modernizing was going to be obsolete eventually. So the question for me is that, is the approach with modernization, we're going to modernize every M1 and every M2, or do we modernize what's sufficient for contingencies and then turn the majority of the resources towards what is the next big thing? What is the Panther that we need to field that'll defeat the T-14? Same thing with the Russians, modernized T-72s, developed 80s, 90s, and now the T-14. But if you get in this, all your resources will go into the modernization of this fleet, M1s, Bradleys, Strykers. And when do you say, I've got enough in those formations right now that I'll take a little risk that the 15th BCT is not going to have the most modern gear?
I think this is fundamental to modernization. What Dr. Johnson just describes as the Army we know. And that's exactly true, because if you look at the Lyra, you look at the SPAR, you look at the POM, as we plan for every vehicle in the out years, on the engineer change proposals we have in place now for the M1 and Bradley, takes us out to almost 2050. Which is not sustainable if you want a weapon system that's going to dominate. So what we're doing, you saw the chart we put up earlier with a maneuver force modernization strategy. Part of that is the combat vehicle modernization strategy execution plan. Right now we have you probably have seen it, combat vehicle modernization strategy. This is largely a narrative. So what we have done down at Fort Benning is take this from narrative and put it to an execution plan that gives you decision points and decision space over time where you can leverage resources out of other programs to get after NGCV. Some of those resources that we leverage comes from engineer change proposals that have been extended across the entire fleet of vehicles. We garner those resources, put it into investment in the future fleet, so we're not continuing to pour good money after bad.
I think it's usually embarrassing that we don't have a combat vehicle in prototype and playing with now, and haven't had really for quite some time. You can't imagine, the Air Force is talking about 6th generation fighters while the 5th generation isn't fielded yet. People are playing with concepts and while you're fielding, and it's something that we don't do in the Army. And I think it's somewhat our human nature and our culture that we can't stand the disruption of tinkering with something new while we're fielding something simultaneously. And that's to our own detriment, I think. So I admire what you're trying to do.
Well, AMC and General Perna don't like it, but...
So I think there's also this fundamental
Maybe we shouldn't
shadow.
mention it at their conference. Please forget that we said anything about that.
I think there's this shadow that's been hanging over the Army for the last 15 years, not just about the wars we've been in, but we talk about failing early and often. The problem is we failed once really big, 3 times. So how do you just put that behind you and say, okay, what did we learn from FCS, Crusader, Comanche that we're not going to do again? And the answer is not to be incremental and risk averse to the point of we're just going to keep doing minor things so we don't do something really bad. You've got to take risk. And it's pretty clear that there's a problem out there that it's a technical problem that can be solved, that's nested inside of the .mil PF and everything else. But, their tanks shoot further than our tanks. Their artillery shoots further than our tanks. They have improved conventional munitions. We're getting rid of them. These are not, really technically difficult problems to get after. And that's why I think, and I applaud what I've seen with the ICDT concept of, what is the problem I'm trying to solve, not as what is the risk I'm trying to avoid. Right.
Any other? How does the current force protection sustainment fit the resurgence of a more expeditionary force? General Wesley?
Again, this is why it's important to have a concept, because the concept drives, it's the lens through which we look at all problems. If we don't have a concept, then we are left to looking at our own experiences. And most of our experiences of the last 15 years is elevates protection to a level that it might not otherwise be raised in a decisive action environment. So, for example, underbelly protection. Underbelly protection was spawned out of the last two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. If you looked at the underbelly protection on an M1 prior to OIF-1 and OEF, it was almost non-existent on an M1 relative to what we have today. So we've got to be careful in designing vehicles and designing formations consistent with where we want to go, not based on our personal experience. And of recent years, our personal experience lifts protection to the maximum level, neglecting mobility as a means of protection, as an example.
So I guess if the adversary is using IEDs, it's because he has nothing else. And if the IEDs are the problem, we have 8,000 MRAPs in storage. IEDs are not going to be the problem in Eastern Europe. We're going to be fighting on terrain that we pretty much are either pre-positioned on or have taken back. And it's just not the problem we need to focus on. If you're fighting at the low end, which I think we'll be engaged in, or the middle end against Hezbollah or someone of that nature, you will need that kind of protection. But you won't need the long-range fire piece. So we have those systems in the military. We have understanding of how to employ them. We need to retain that knowledge, but understand that that is not the problem we need to design the future force against as a military problem.
Right. You said another way, an IED is merely a mine, and mines have been around for decades, right? And how did we reconcile the problem with mines? We maneuvered. The reason you had to raise protection is because maneuver was taken off the plate if you're in an environment such as coin, et cetera. So we just got to be careful to not heed all the lessons of the last 15 years and then use concepts to drive where we're going.
So I think some of the challenges, in this kind of environment where your enemy is uncertain, and it could go from coin to state actors, and you have to build a force that's capable of fighting along all those different dimensions, is especially challenging when you're trying to tell the Army story and argue for resources. 5 years ago, had we talked and described a Russian threat, we would have been laughed out of the building, frankly. So I just think it reinforces for us that this Army's got to be ready to go anywhere at any time and do anything that the nation asks us to do. And we have to be able to tell that story better than what we did back then, because we frankly forfeited an era where we could have been preparing for this kind of capability better.
Any other comments?
I'd just add, having some experiences. So, I think if we could make our vehicles a little bit more modular, I think the idea of kitting is good, right? And what I would tell you is then you can continue to work on the next generation best of anything, right? But we have the tendency that says, I got to have an armored Humvee and I'm going to buy whatever it is, 40% of the Army kits. I tell you, I thought that was way too many, right? I mean, during these wars of however many years, I never had more than 20,000 tactical vehicles deployed. Right? So I would argue you need to have enough armor of the best you got for those that are going to deploy quickly and be a procurement away from the best stuff today, right? And the hard part is what is going to be that, right? So that you can continually upgrade the technology, have the S&T guys working for the next stuff, and have less stuff in inventory, but enough so the people that are going to field within that first year have the best kit available the day they deploy.
Great point.
I think the one thing I would add is that, as we do this and we talk about concept development, we just got to we can't constrain our thinking in certain ways that limit the possibilities of what we can do. We have to look, and this is more Eric's lane than mine, but you have to look across dot mil PF. And so, for example, in some of the discussions that I've heard with regard to mobile protected firepower or the next tank, the next generation combat vehicle, or the next platform, in those discussions, when we start talking about the key features that we need in a platform to be able to have it be more lethal, more mobile, more protected, we often rule out certain features. So, for example, if you bring up the topic of an autonomous platform, or if you bring up the topic of having reduce the size of the number of soldiers or the number of personnel that can fit in a combat platform, oftentimes we start getting into these debates that just run us around in circles instead of thinking about the possibility to say, hey, you could split the squad and have 2 vehicles. What's the trade-offs with doing that? Now, that probably affects your ability to be expeditionary, but you got to think about things in those terms. You start thinking about you could make an aviation platform autonomous, but then you reject that because you say, well, we absolutely have no intention of flying maneuvering soldiers in an aviation platform that is autonomous or semi-autonomous. And so sometimes we have to challenge our thinking in those areas to say, could it be that rather than rule out across the board an autonomous aviation platform, could it be that the logistics supply piece of it or the attack piece of it can be autonomous? Or when you talk about MUM-T, you can have one platform that is occupied and the other platform, the companion platform, that is unoccupied, but it is tethered and controlled by the platform vehicle. So we just have to kind of keep our range of thoughts and ideas a little bit broader and then take those out into crucibles where we test these things and put a critical eye on it and look at the strengths and weaknesses.
Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, so I think, so we brought up some really good points. Part of this is cultural and what we think right looks like. I know when the MPF requirements were first coming out, one of the requirements is that have 3 to 4 members in the crew. I thought it was that you don't want any more than that. No, we have to have at least that many. And we can't have an autoloader. And so why is that? Well, 3 to 4 is what it takes to do maintenance and provide security for the vehicle. So, well, if it's an MPF and it's vital to the security of the formation it's supporting, those light guys will probably provide security. And the autoloader is based on experiences from a generation ago about how they always broke down. You can't have autonomy without an autoloader. So that assumption that those 2 things are on the 11th and 12th commandments on Moses' stones will keep you from moving forward in autonomy. I guess the other piece is that, my wife was a China scholar for years, and she had a friend from China that said, the problem with Americans, we're in this place now where the pendulum's swinging. You either overwhelm or you underwhelm. If you ever learn to whelm, you'd be really dangerous.
Just for clarity, we've broken the tablets, and we can't have an autoloader now.
And we like overwhelming better
young
than
guy.
whelming. Overwhelming's okay.
General Lennox, based on your G8 and OSD Cape time, can you address how headquarters DA can shift from current versus future budgeting and programming to a current to future approach?
Wow, if I could do that, I'd probably still be in uniform. And I probably won't answer the question very well. I think our major challenge in budgeting is telling our story. And it's telling our story to OSD, who we don't seem to communicate well with. I think for 15 or 16 years, we thought we're giving our lifeblood in the Army, and our sons and daughters are fighting and dying in godforsaken places in the world, and that it ought to be intuitive to our civilian leadership, both in the Pentagon and on the Hill, about the inherent need for an extraordinarily capable, well-trained, and equipped Army. And frankly, that just wasn't true. They didn't understand. There was belief still of, antiseptic combat, of, striking from afar or above or away, or the presence of a ship off the coast, and that would magically change behaviors on the shore. And you didn't need an Army. And it's certainly, if you had to have one, it would have to be as small as humanly possible, and we don't want to spend a lot to equip and modernize it. And we just thought we didn't have to tell that story. So as a result of them not understanding, I think we lost resources. And it's not only an OSD, but it's on the Hill. And there are all sorts of advocates on the Hill for all sorts of things, like the United States Navy, 350-ship Navy, like the United States Army National Guard. There's all sorts of pockets there, but there's not a United States Army really pocket there on the Hill. So our ability to communicate is incredibly important if we want to shape the future budgetary environment. And I don't think I answered the question very well, but I think it's not a budgeteer's job. It's really the job of our best strategists and our best thinkers and our leaders to be able to communicate continuously why you need this Army and why it's got to have the flexibility to do the kind of things we're asking it to do.
You know, what I would add, and people may disagree, is I think one of the things that the Army has done that I think has been very valuable, it doesn't get to everything, but I think it helps tell the story, at least where we're spending our resources, is what was the LERA and now the SPAR, right? Because what that does is it sort of looks at portfolios and says, you know, as you know, before those two processes, we always had the POM, and then we had the budget after the POM, right? We'd go through the ceiling. Well, the idea of those things is what are the resources I think I'm going to get, and hopefully it'll be more than we have got, and where am I going to go after Abrams and Bradley ECP, right? I mean, when is the decisions we have to make to go to the next combat vehicle, or go to the next radio, or go to the next whatever, and that sort of tells the story, at least of what we're thinking. The hard part is, how do we get on with modernization, because all I can afford is ECPs. Right.
That's a better answer.
In your discussions, you mentioned DIRT CTCs and small group instruction in the center course as key contributors to build the previous maneuver force. What are some of the ideas or elements of the DOTML PF besides the platforms should the institutional or generating force focus their efforts on in order to lead change in building the future maneuver force?
So I think everybody here probably could comment on this one way or the other and run down the full spectrum of DOTML PF. So I won't take all the time. I'll mention one, and it's leader development. It's one that we're passionate about down at Fort Benning. But in the environment that we talk about that we're observing in Ukraine, but also in terms of the capabilities of our near peers, what we can imagine is an environment that is a hyperactive battlefield with ubiquitous sensors, decentralized operations moving very fast with lethal effects. Also includes episodic loss of communications and maybe up for extended periods of time. And so an environment where you're decentralized and the battlefield is nonlinear and it's exceedingly lethal and you lose your ability to communicate, what you need is leaders that have the ability to make decisions upon independent initiative. And so what we're talking about is mission command. The problem with mission command is we don't do it. We talk about it, but we don't do it. And I'm oftentimes saying that we're drunk on information and we're drunk on permission, because we can. So we have to create training environments. We have to train leaders who say training lanes where a leader is forced to do that which he was told not to do because it's consistent with the intent of the operation. That's a tough training event to build, but that's the kind of leaders that we need to train up for this environment of the future.
You know, it's funny, Eric, that you mentioned that, because that's Jim Greer's point in that strategy article that he wrote, that we have lost that risk-taking and individual initiative. I can remember a Reforger exercise, and man, does that date me. General Ham and I are probably the only ones that have experienced those. But in the middle of that exercise, General Maddox, who was the U.S. Army Europe commander at the time, briefed a portion of the exercise where he was not going to have a reserve. And I went up to him afterward. I was a fresh guy right out of Command General Staff College, and I told him that I would have failed at Command General Staff College had I presented a plan that didn't have a reserve, and asked him why he chose to do it that way. And he basically said, that's the only way that I can win. So it's the ability to take risk used to be, I think, more second nature to us, and determine where the right places were to take risk. And it's a hard thing to do, but my hat's off to you for trying.
Dr. Johnson?
Yes, I understand all the .mil PFP and how important training leader development are, but I'd enjoin everybody to go watch the movie Fury. The section where a tank platoon is moving down a road, loses one to a Panzerfaust because there's no defense on a Sherman against, a close-in RPG, just like there's no defense on an M1 against an ATGM. They're ambushed by one Tiger I, and they are trained, they are cohesive, they're well-led. I mean, it's Brad Pitt, so they got to be well-led. And these guys have been fighting since North Africa, continuously. And they lose 4 of the 5 tanks between the Panzerfaust and the Tiger I because the only way they can defeat a Tiger I with a Sherman with a 75 or a 76 is to get within 300 yards with a rear or a flank shot. And the Tiger just has to sit there in neutral stare and take them out. And they finally get it. And there's one well-trained, cohesive crew left with Brad Pitt in it. That is we can't soldier our way out of technical problems. We can mitigate risk in these technical problems, but you have to put equipment in the hands of soldiers that will give them the advantage when they get in the close fight. And I think we're in jeopardy of not having that. We don't have it now, and the next generation combat vehicle is going to have to provide that as the other guy continues to modernize what he has.
If okay, sir, I'm going to add a comment in here because many know that I'm kind of a human dimension zealot. And the key to all of this, we've been talking about modernization of stuff, but what is there's advances in cognitive sciences and training technologies that can significantly enhance the performance of leaders and decision makers. And as we look, this is a comment, not a question, but the point is we ought to be exploring the modernization of how do we better train and educate our leaders for the future. And the basic observation now is we're giving them iPads, but we're still doing 1960s and 7 training kinds of concepts. We don't understand how they really learn. And these kind of sciences, when we started the human dimension concept, we wanted to go out there. General Wallace asked me to go figure out, as the Op 4 commander, I fought hundreds of battles. We need to get all our commanders to fight hundreds of battles so they can determine their risks, so they can determine what they can do with the systems that they had. And for those that don't know, the Op 4 really did have worse equipment than the Blue 4. So that wasn't a snivel. But the key is, it was the leaders that made the difference, not the equipment. And we ought to be looking at, and General Wallace's guidance was, I need a commander's UCOF. I need the ability for a commander to have 1,000 rotations so he can make, as we know now, develop those neural networks for instinctive decision making versus, let's say, deliberate decision making, which takes a lot longer. So as we look through this, and sir, you mentioned the leader development, I would propose we also look at, which costs really not much at all, how do we really look at how we do training, education, and those kind of pieces to take advances in what are clearly game-changing kind of capabilities in education and leadership. So if anybody else wants to comment on that, I'll go to the next question. How do we balance modernization against individual players versus state forces?
The other day, senior leaders were talking about, how you modernize your Army. Do you use a capabilities-based model or do you use a threat-based model? And there was some vigorous discussion on that. The conclusion that was a collective conclusion amongst the group was you do both. And there's a reason you do both. First, you have to build your Army based on a threat model. If you go back to the 1970s, like the example I used earlier, if we had just used a capabilities analysis against the Soviet Union in the 1970s, we would have gone back to the factories and just manufactured more tanks and more artillery tubes. But we decided that we can't just go tank for tank, tube for tube, that we need to take a more nuanced solution because we can't afford to build in those volumes. So ergo, we concluded that we had to fight outnumbered and win. And we needed to be able to defeat the enemy over the length of the battlefield so that we didn't have to deal with him all at once, hence airland battle. So now you look at the current threat, and you got to build your Army against the threat in the aggregate with his aggregate capabilities. But you can't just build against the Russian threat right now as a pacing threat, because why? Because of the proliferation of technology and the proliferation of weapons. So you have to, when you get to your program of record of an individual system, you have to look at best of breed. Because the Chinese may make an ATGM this month in China, and we may find it in another part of the world 3 months from now. So just to reiterate, I think you've got to do both. You've got to build against a pacing threat. That's how you build your Army. And then when you build programs of record, you've got to be cognizant of the best of breed throughout the world.
So I think it's a great point, and you know, it dawned on me just now that sitting on the panel are two deputy PA&E veterans, those in uniform that probably wouldn't admit it in public, but that know that when you build a POM, they have kind of a model that goes through trying to prioritize certain things from the field. And it reminds me that Sir Michael Howard used to say something to the effect, well, at least don't get it wrong. You won't get it completely right, but at least don't get it too wrong. So I think in the building the Army process, you have to figure out how to build in some agility so that you have capabilities in a number of areas so that when you get it wrong, you can very quickly audible and onto the right path. So if you start building a combat vehicle that is very large, and you're going to need that combat vehicle to be very large, great, you're on a path to do it. But you can't ignore the other capabilities. So it's almost across the spectrum, you've got to invest in it, and then you've got to make sure your industry and your labs and others are ready to go, and they have a program ongoing that they can leverage and go with when they need to.
So I think the really kind of, we've talked about this other times, but I talked about it the other day, is that there are really three kinds of adversaries that we're going to face, and they all use derivative Russian or Chinese materiel. And so the military materiel question, the Russian pacing threat for what you have to procure pretty much works down that level of irregulars with RPGs, up to hybrid adversaries with anti-tank guided missile man pads and rockets, up to state capabilities. So the materiel problem is understandable, and by the way, NGIC knows what every country in the world has and what they're going to have out in the future. The question about fighting different kinds of adversaries is, in the context of training leader development, is recognizing which one it is, and it's an intellectual doctrine problem. So I'm not going to do, I think the big mistake we made in the 70s that we unlearned in 2003 is everything's not a lesser included case in the Russians. It may be in a material sense, but it's not in an intellectual doctrine training leader development sense. And you have to pay attention to the low end because there may be capabilities like IEDs that you have to have a material solution for. But the vast majority of killing systems that are out there, if you can deal with the Cornet, you can deal with the Sagger. If you can deal with the SA, with the Verba manpad, you can deal with the SA-7. So the question, how do you put your head against the problems and train leaders to understand what the problem is and not make them all the same problem?
I guess I'd just kind of offer that, everything that we think about and do in terms of how we come up with doctrine, how we organize ourselves, how we resource ourselves, even how we look at what we're doing in technology development is largely by commodity areas, right? Mm-hmm. So we have warfighting functions, right? And all those warfighting functions are broken into, you've got aviation, you've got ground maneuver, you've got sustainment, you've got maneuver support. So they're in commodity areas. When we look at how we resource things, we've got them broken down into commodity areas. We've got mission command systems or the comm systems all in a bin. We've got the combat vehicles in a bin. We've got fires in a bin. And then when we do it on the technology side, we have portfolio areas. And, one of the comments that I heard the chief make very early on in his tenure was, hey, there are some basics that we've always taught ourselves in the Army, which is move, shoot, communicate, and then back in the day we used to say sustain and survive. And so, you know, maybe we need to kind of think about how you can break that mold of these commodity areas and start thinking about holistically. If I have to shoot, it doesn't say that I have to shoot with a tank. I have to be able to shoot from long distances with my fire. So it's all the different ways in which I can shoot and be effective. So I want to be able to be lethal. I want to sometimes have to be able to mass when I want to be able to fight from the air. And so I want to be able to fight from all domains. So maybe somehow we need to think about how we break that up, because it all gets condensed when we start having these budget discussions and we start talking about how much money do we have in the aviation portfolio versus how much money do we have in the mission command portfolio versus the combat maneuver portfolio. And sooner or later you have to recognize that you have to bring all those pieces and parts together in order to be able to fight and fight effectively.
There was some mention of international collaboration, but at a closer inspection, international collaboration is at its weakest point in decades. Their M1 Abrams has dozens, in other words, international M1's Abrams has dozens of foreign S&T subsystems. What is the Army really doing to leverage foreign capabilities for our Army? Any insight on that?
So I think I'd go back to the comment where we have international, so similar to the cooperative agreements that we have with industry, we go working with the folks up in ASALT to establish international arrangements, international agreements with our key partners to look at and develop technology and also understand what's going on out in the international space in terms of technology development. So I think there's a fair amount of that going on. I don't know that we, as a culture, we are accepting oftentimes in readily bringing them into our systems, and so that's something that we certainly need to look at getting better at. But I think there's a fair amount that goes on in terms of that type of collaboration, both with industry. I mean, I just came back from France, where we have a international armaments, and I can't remember what the last word was, but an international armaments, and I want to say it was agreement session. But we sat down and we talked about the different opportunities where we could better collaborate to work on technological solutions. I think when we get to the more advanced stages, we get to things that are 6.3, 6.4 and beyond, and we start talking about systems that were built by non-Army customers, and maybe some subsystems are brought in, there's a reluctance to be accepting. I think we kind of want our own brand, so to speak. We relish our own brand, and so I think that's an area we can get better. You know, it probably creates a certain degree of competition, perhaps in commercial industry, U.S. commercial industry too.
Okay.
Well, I think it's out there. I think you know, my vast 3 years experience. It may not be with the Army, but I watched in the amphibious combat vehicle competition for the Marine Corps. The winners brought in vehicles, one from Iveco's at Italy and one from Singapore, and they're building them in the U.S., but they partnered internationally, bringing that capability. So I think now more, again, 3 years experience, but I think there is a lot of bringing in international capabilities and ideas.
You know, I'd add, so I think there is a big desire to do that. The other thing I see is more international industry interesting in the U.S. market for obvious reasons. You know, there's a couple challenges. One is we are all, I think, for, and we do a good job of bringing in technologies from other countries. We're not necessarily open to building a lot of stuff in another country, because we have example after example, and I go through a bunch, that because of a conflict we were in, that country may or may not support what we're doing, and we may or may not get what we want. So that's some of the difficulty is we are all open for this technology. How do you bring it here? And then there's also the part of that is Congress tends to incentivize us to build and have jobs here. But there's a whole bunch of good stuff internationally from a technology perspective.
Just real quick.
Go ahead.
So two systems that kind of came to mind, and again, I'm talking, things that are more mature. We're really talking, our active protection systems, right? Being able to look at what's out there and recognizing that there are advancements in that particular arena that we have yet to achieve, and then the willingness of our leadership to say, hey, look, in an effort to get that to the force quickly, our choices are to continue to work to develop it in-house or work in conjunction with industry, or look out at the landscape and see what's out there, and then make a determination on how well that suits the Army requirements. But then you've got to get over that hurdle to, again, get past that branding hurdle. The same thing with, the maneuver support vessel. We're looking at what's out there in the commercial space that might represent a suitable platform for us, and we're finding that there are things out there that might be being built by foreign competitors.
Okay, go ahead, Dr.
Yeah, I think APS is my model of what the challenges are in this arena. So the Russians started building active protection, and the requirement in Afghanistan when they're on their third generation with the T-14. Every modern state army has active protection on its tanks. The South Koreans, the Russians, the Germans, and we don't, because we never demanded it. And so this gets to an interesting question of how do you field things? And so one approach is to test, which we've been doing for 2 years, and we're still going to test another couple of years. We could have a number of systems modified to fit on 4 deployed forces within a year. But that's not what our system will drive us to. And you could have done a foreign system almost immediately and co-produced it here if you're going to do that one, while you're in parallel saying, is there a better system out there? So what this has been a problem that was identified in 2006 in Lebanon. And our approach has been, we got to do this. And we got to do it quick. And then that's the first couple of days of conversation. The next year of conversations, we talk ourselves out of it. Because how do you integrate it with ground force? Well, you turn it on, you turn it off. How do is it really going to protect you? Well, yeah. Because, it's Israeli tanks that came out of Lebanon in this last engagement. We were over there and talking to people. Came out with big black marks on the sides of their vehicles. And they didn't even know that the active protection had activated to shoot down the RPGs that were being shot at them. So I think our system will test everything to death. And by the time it gets to the field, it's past being needed.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left, and I've got one more question. It was actually for Dr. Johnson, but we'll open it up to everybody else. What lessons should the Army unlearn, or bad habits? Dr. Johnson.
I think what we've traditionally done is extrapolate the enemy we're fighting now. It's not refighting the last war. It is fighting the war that we have experience in. I think knowledge is experiential. Your mind is framed about what you've done in your career. And we have an Army where there's 2 generations of officers who have a mindset, a mental model of what war is like. And it's over on this end, and all this stuff on the right is waiting for them. So when they see problems, they frame it from the context of what my experience has been, and it's been hard-earned experience. So I think what we have to unlearn is that everybody is not the Taliban or EQI. And what we have to learn and teach our leaders is that don't talk to me about warfighting challenges generically. Talk to me about that warfighting challenge against the Taliban, against Hezbollah, against Russians. Because the solution intellectually and a material perspective will be different across those. And we've talked about, I was the provost of the National Defense University in 1994. And teaching officers to be critical thinkers has been a landmark of our educational system for over 100 years, since Elihu Root. And we talk about it, and the question is, are we doing that? And if we're not, what do we need to do to fix it? Thanks.
Anyone else?
I'd mention two. I think I've already mentioned one of them, and that's protection. It's not to say that Maneuver Center is cavalier towards the protection of our soldiers, but if we want to optimize everything towards protection, we can do that very easily without deploying. In the end, we have to achieve strategic objectives, which requires maneuver, which requires killing, which requires agility and speed. And so I think what we need to do is based on what we've learned the last 15 years, where protection became preeminent because we couldn't maneuver, because we couldn't go fast, because we didn't have agility in a normal combat environment. We've got to be careful not to celebrate at the fount of protection. The second thing is a larger cultural one for our nation. Because we are a Western democratic nation, we've spent 2 centuries celebrating virtue, among other things, in acquisition. And I think that we could probably unlearn the preeminence of precluding corruption or losses in favor of a little more agility. To get agility in acquisition requires some risk, and it'll require risk on the part of the body politic, it'll require risk on the part of Congress, it'll require risk on the part of the acquisition community. But if you want to turn fast, there's going to have to be some assumption of risk.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to thank the panel for your comments, and if the audience could give a round of applause.
Well, thanks, General Wesley and General Palmer.